Hey guys, and welcome back to this new Devo series called This Ain't That. This week we are going to be looking at the Sabbath versus Sunday, but not in the way you might think. Hey guys, welcome back. If you like these videos, please remember to give us a thumbs up. And if you aren't yet, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel where we have many more Devos just like this, as well as our weekly Shabbat Fellowship Torah portions and teachings. Also, if you hit the little bell icon, you'll be notified automatically every time we upload a video. So before we jump in this week, I want to say a couple of things that I did not mention last week. So first off, who exactly is this series for? Well, these videos are intended to speak mostly to those who grew up in a religious system and are now seeking the truths of God, not bound by a religious culture, especially those who have found that Torah, or the law, is still valid, applicable, and yes, even profitable for believers today. So if you're new to imitating Yeshua's way of living the Torah as your lifestyle of worship to the King, many mindsets that you brought over from Christianity will make this walk incredibly difficult if we don't get them sorted out. So most of you watching this have some sort of religious background, whether Catholic or Protestant, conservative or liberal, Christian or Jewish. In this series, we're going to be contrasting some mindsets that we all may have or maybe even still do see as normal and right with some opposing ideas from Scripture. One point I want to make is that, listen, I grew up in conservative evangelical Christianity. So that will be my reference point. I say that because I'm going to be saying things like, in the church we believed, but, or in the church we taught, but, or Christianity teaches this or that, but. And I want to be very clear that my intent is not to divide us from nor offend any of our Christian brothers or sisters who are actively seeking and doing their best to serve the Father. But there are some mindsets that those of us who grew up in church hold to that are simply not in line with God's heart, and actually they're directly contradictory to His words. These are ideas being even propagated by preachers and teachers, evangelists, and self-proclaimed prophets that are creating a false sense of hope. And when that falsity is realized and people's lives begin to fall apart, too many, sadly, turn away from Yeshua and the Father. So listen, this series is not about encouraging you to simply be comfortable and stay in the frustration, confusion, and indecisiveness where you currently live. That's an awful place to be. And we all think and act in ways that Messiah never thought nor acted. And if He is the mark we aim to imitate, we have to deal with some of these hard issues. The reputation of Yeshua, our Messiah, and the King is at stake. So let's jump in. All right, so as we said at the beginning, the first This Ain't That we're going to tackle in this series is the Sabbath versus Sunday. But we're not going to spend any time proving why Saturday is the Sabbath and why it is still a blessing and our responsibility as believers to keep and guard the Sabbath. There is plenty of info online you can find, and it's incredibly clear in Scripture. But I want to address some other things surrounding the Sabbath and its observance that I think are important, maybe as important. And if you're coming from a traditional Christian background, I want to tackle some mindsets that may make the Sabbath a difficult thing to wrap our heads around, to grasp. So let's look at some ways that this, the Sabbath, ain't that Sunday worship. All right, so let's set a baseline. In Deuteronomy 30, God says, "For this command which I am commanding you today is not too hard for you, nor is it far off. It is not in the heavens to say, who shall ascend into the heavens for us, and bring it to us, and cause us to hear it, so that we do it. Nor is it beyond the sea to say, who shall go over the sea for us, and bring it to us, and cause us to hear it, so that we do it. For the word is very near you, in your mouth and in your heart, to do it." So straight off the jump, I want to remind you that if keeping the Sabbath seems like a burden, seems like it's difficult, when God clearly said it's not the Sabbath that's the problem. It's us. There is something in us that God is wanting to change so that we can think like He does. This is part of that whole dying to the flesh thing. Fun, right? So how is the Sabbath not like traditional Sunday worship? Well, in this video, I want to address at least one, maybe a couple glaring differences that many struggle with in hopes that we can gain a better understanding and practice of keeping the heart of the Sabbath especially. So Genesis 1 tells us that the day actually begins at sunset. In God's calendar, a day is from sunset to sunset. Exodus 31 and Leviticus 23, among other places, are where we find the instructions of the Sabbath day. Most of us know this. Sunday worship really isn't a day. I mean, let's be honest, it's called the day of the Lord. But if you've gone to church on a Sunday, had a worship experience, heard a message, and maybe even participated in a Sunday school or discipleship class, you've basically honored the day of worship. Well, this ain't that. God's instruction to us is that we would dedicate a day to Him, not part of a day. When we begin to celebrate the Sabbath, our tendency is to treat it like what we've done our whole lives in church. If you have a Sabbath fellowship to attend, simply going to the Sabbath meeting and doing your religious duty is not keeping the Sabbath. Congregational meeting, as we're commanded in Leviticus 23, a holy convocation, is part of the Sabbath, but not the whole of the Sabbath. See, the Sabbath doesn't start when service starts, and it doesn't end when service ends. If your congregation or your fellowship meets on Friday evenings, you don't have all of Saturday to do what you want just because you've already fulfilled your obligations and met on Friday evening. You still have a whole day to Shabbat, to rest. Likewise, if your fellowship meets on Saturday, it's not just enough to carve out of your Saturday enough time to run to fellowship, then take the rest of the day to do whatever you want. If that's how we're keeping the Sabbath, I would argue to say we're not keeping the Sabbath at all. All we've really done is moved Sunday church to Saturday. We've just changed days of the week. And I mean, come on, like, you know how it goes. Some will say, oh, if I can just make it to church. Or it's Sunday, so we have to go to church. And we pretty up and say we get to go to church, but same thing. Or we get all dressed up and geared up, psyched up emotionally and mentally for Sunday worship so we can put on our best face and walk in the building. And then when it's over, we go back to whoever we were. We tend to think that just because we enter a building on Sunday, that we are honoring God and will get His blessing. The keeping of the Sabbath is not simply about entering a building, but it is a segment of space in time where we get to rest in Him and turn our hearts away from what we want to Him and to what He desires. It's so important that we understand this. So let me ask you this. What did you go to church for? For some, it was for rest. For some, it was encouragement, hope, joy, relationship, and belonging. I'm not downplaying those things because they're very important. But in keeping the Sabbath, we shouldn't have to put on a pretty face, a facade, in order to walk into the building so everybody thinks we're okay. We shouldn't have to strive to get to the building in hopes of finding the breath of life and hope we're yearning for. The Sabbath doesn't begin when the first notes of worship are struck. It doesn't begin when the first song is sung. When you walk into your Sabbath meeting, you should already have begun Shabbating, kind of a Joeism, since sunset. You shouldn't have to be encouraged to worship or to pray or to participate in the service. You should have been worshiping and praying since Friday evening. There is such a huge weight on ministers in churches and in Torah communities because of the pressure that they have to coax people into worship. It's like pulling a 747 down the runway. Pastors are leaving the ministry in droves because of the weight of having to cause people to be excited about God. So the Sabbath should be teaching us that it is our responsibility, yours and mine, to meet with the King. It's not the pastor's responsibility to bring the King to us. It's not the teacher's responsibility to tell you how to think or what to believe, or it's not their responsibility to grow your relationship with the Father. See, when we keep the Sabbath, we come together at our Sabbath convocation. It's full of joy and peace and hope because we're all of the same mind. We're in God's rhythm because we have taken it upon ourselves to honor His timing and to prepare for the King, which begins Friday night at sunset. So ask yourself, is this a mindset that I need to look at in my life? Would an adjustment here help me to understand the blessing of the Father's Sabbath better? Okay, so here's another way this ain't that. Exodus 31:13 tells us, "My Sabbaths you are to guard by all means, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, to know that I, the Lord, am setting you apart." So was or is Sunday church simply an addition to your life, something you really didn't bother with except when it was Sunday or late Saturday night? Or maybe it was something that really didn't affect the rest of your week at all. Were you simply committed to an institution? That's a great question. In Exodus 31, Abba tells us that the Sabbath, in contrast to the way many of us approach Sunday worship, is a sign, not simply something we do because of religious guilt, which is a thing, or cultural expectations, which is a thing, but that it tells everyone who we are and whose we are, because we are acknowledging the day that He set apart. I like to think of the Sabbaths and feasts of the Lord as His heartbeat in time. Every 7 days, every Saturday, the heart of God is beating and calling out for us to meet with Him. If we believe God's words, that the Sabbath is a sign, then our entire lives should revolve around the Sabbath. If He were to look over the earth to find His children, would the sign we are carrying identify us as His? It shouldn't be something that sneaks up on us, guys. Again, if your fellowship meeting on Shabbat, while important, is the main way you keep the Sabbath, then you're honestly not having a full understanding of the heart of the Sabbath instruction, and you aren't getting the true blessing of rest that He has for you. Is the Sabbath just a meeting you attend, or do you carry it as a sign that you're His? If you find yourself struggling with the Sabbath in this way, it may be that you need to address this mindset. So while some may attend church out of obligation, many, like myself, are seeking an experience. It's like a drug that we have to keep coming back for. And listen, I've been the most guilty of this. Spirit-filled churches in particular bill their services as spiritual experiences with miraculous altar calls that can cure all of your ills. The problem is that honestly, many of our ills are because we simply won't come in line with God's instructions. I know we don't like to say that, but that's the truth. You know, His instructions, the way He said we are to live this life, His Torah. We've turned the things of God into magic. But here's the thing, we don't believe in magic. I mean, do we honestly believe that we can belligerently disobey the Father, yet twist His arm into blessing us through emotional worship and faith-filled prayers? And don't misunderstand, we all mess up. And I believe, as the scriptures tell us, that God desires our worship and He responds to our prayers, and thankfully He does. I'm simply offering that many of the challenges we go to church begging for help with wouldn't actually be issues if we did things the way He said originally. And personally, I believe it all begins with the Sabbath. So the Sabbath is not Sunday church, guys. And if we don't correct this mindset, we will continue to be frustrated and empty, just like many of us were in traditional Christianity. So I pray you find the heart of the Father's Sabbath rest, the weightier part of that, and begin to rely on Him for the blessing that only comes from honoring His ways. So until next time, shalom.